Today I'd just like to break the ice by starting out with a true story. When I was teaching economics many years ago at the University of Pretoria, when we only had 4 provinces, this actually happened to me. I was teaching economics, low SAL, 250 students, and midterm, after the lecture, usually midterm with a large group, there's a couple of students that want to speak to the lecturer, usually to arrange for some extra marks or to arrange for a SIG test. And when the usual suspects had left, this student approached me and he said, "Dr. Botha, we enjoy your lectures, even though it's economics. And he appreciates my humor and he wants to tell me a joke." So I said, "No, go ahead." So I asked me a question. He asked me, why is it that in the Cape Province there are relatively more botas than cockroaches? Now just remember, the Afrikaans for cockroach is kakkerlak. But in Natal it's the other way around. You know, there were more cockroaches than botas in the relative terms, and I didn't have a clue. So out came the answer. Natal had first choice. And just to demonstrate my objectivity, he passed economics 1 at his first attempt. So we found out later that his dad was also in politics, and he was. This is not profanity. This is the official Afrikaans translation of extremely frustrated. He was gatvol for the fact that there were 4 botas in the cabinet in that year. Things have changed, of course. Until recently, there was a bota lazy, but it's not quite the same anymore. Anyway, on to more serious stuff. The economic impact of the SA drone industry with reflections on the state of the macroeconomy. Sean, thank you for the opportunity. Sean and Avril. I was concerned at one point that we would not get enough survey results in, but then I realized that I could combine them with last year's results and work on an average, and I managed to do it scientifically enough. For those of you that did return those surveys, which were treated confidentially, all the information was aggregated and then averaged out and translated into ratios which I could use for the impact assessment. I just want to say, from the bottom of my heart, thank you very much. Economists won't have a job if we don't have data. We need data, obviously, to work on trends, etc., and I really appreciate that. My suggestion next year, Sean, is that we start the survey exercise in January, and we nag them. Even if we have to go and visit them, I can get some students. I stayed next to the University of Pretoria. We'll give them 6 black labels and a couple of bucks and let them go and nag the people to get a little bit more information. But I think we've got enough. I believe we have enough. Just on aviation in general, if you look at the global rankings for the quality of air transport infrastructure, selected countries and BRICS, you'll notice that South Africa compares extremely favorably, surprisingly favorably actually, to people that think of South Africa as part of Africa. There are pockets of excellence, obviously, in this continent, but you have to sort of look out to find them, especially in Somalia, in South Sudan, and Central African Republic, not to mention DR Congo, where 4 million people have lost their lives in the last 10 years in a civil war. Same passports. So they cheer the national soccer side on a Sunday, and Monday they start killing each other again. They should start digging the ground and planting maize, as far as I'm concerned. That's a combined population of Botswana and Namibia. The civil war must stop. That is what Africa needs to do. And in South Africa, I just want to remind you of the fact that on 27 April, just the other day, less than a month ago, we celebrated our democracy, 27 April 1994. Not only did we get a democratic constitution, but we averted a civil war. And that is something that we should say thank you to the Heavenly Father every day for. And I do that, by the way, when I remember. So this place is a magnet for people from the rest of this continent, and by the last estimate, there are 10 million permanent visitors from north of the Limpopo in South Africa. And if a country is a magnet for inward migration, then certainly there's a lot of things that are happening. And as far as aviation is concerned, commercial aviation, I've got absolutely no doubt that South Africa will continue to play a leading role in this continent and also act, as you can see from this slide, act as a benchmark for some other countries. We are in a better position than some Western European countries, including Portugal and Greece. Our public finance is also much better than Greece's, if you know what I mean. So, well done on that score. If you look at the CASA, that's the Commercial Aviation Association of Southern Africa, quite a number of board members are here today, and welcome to you. I hope I've got some new jokes for you. Our Aviation Activity Index, the last one, we've got the first quarter of 2018, those results will be out shortly. But the good news is that this downward trend has been turned around in the fourth quarter of last year. And it's amazing how many indicators, and I'll get to that a little bit later after this section, how many key economic indicators in South Africa turned around in the last quarter of 2018. An historic event took place in December last year with the change in the leadership of the governing party. That is what you call a paradigm shift. Because we went from a president that spent 10 years trying to stay out of jail to one that knows exactly where this country needs to go to and which policies to follow. And they are not nationalization, and they are not state capture. And if the Guptas are on the run, then you know we're on the right road. So, a paradigm shift by no means. And I'll get back to that a little bit later. I mean, who of you has heard the term Ramaphoria? I think we all understand what that means. But can you quantify this? Yes, you can. And I'll get to that section in a moment. As far as the application of unmanned aircraft services is concerned, this is just a selection. In my literature study, which underpinned the impact assessment, Sean, it was just absolutely amazing how this is just, unraveling and it's being added to almost on a weekly basis. They even now, the researchers on this industry globally, they've even now got a little list which talks about acceptable services, which you perform. And they would include, obviously, some of the stuff like sea rescue operations and so on. But I've just read a story about some lifeguard who says that because one particular drone dropped into the sea, he said that we must still be a little bit careful, to what extent we utilize this. But the other drone was able to tell them where the two people were that were probably going to drown, and they could get to them. So the application, the range of applications is just expanding all the time. And certainly this is what we call in macroeconomics, and this excites me a little bit, we call this a sunrise industry. You have sunset industries as well, like for instance, typewriter manufacturing. And then you have sunrise industries. And there are a lot of people that say that, this fourth industrial revolution, the artificial intelligence, the robots, etc. out there, this is going to threaten jobs. I think McKinsey has said that 20% of all jobs today will be lost by 2025 because of robotics and artificial intelligence. What they don't tell you is how many jobs will be created as a result of this whole new supply chain. And the same thing I think holds for drone industries. The drone industry, this is a sector which globally is growing exponentially. Okay, now we get to the meat of the impact assessment. And, no, not yet. This is just some interesting facts, and this has changed from last year. I decided to give you some new ones. Number of global drone sales in 2018, 3 million. Value of global drone sales in 2017, 12 billion rand. In other words, just over $1 billion US, or just under, depending on what the exchange rate is doing. It was rumored last year that some analysts were suggesting, during the last stages of the Zuptastan era, that the rand should be renamed the yo-yo. I mean, you remember what it did, But that's better than the Zim currency. That's the dodo. And by the way, if you want a currency to be named the dodo, then you must expropriate land without compensation. Right. It's not a good idea. And I don't think it's going to happen. And actually, we'll be talking to that for a minute or two. Then we get back to drones. Number of leisure aircraft, 3.5 million in the US. That's estimates. Commercial ones, 1 million by 2021. Remote pilots in the US in 2012. That must be 2017. No, 2021. Sorry about that. And 281,000. That's absolutely amazing. And I've got a lot of respect for people that can fly that stuff. Value of European demand for UA's, for the services in this industry, valued at 10 billion euros per annum. Timing of the launch of a 1-ton capacity drone, that's around the corner. Cost saving on delivery by drone in rural Asia is about 70%. On average, if you manufacture a product, from a car to a plastic bottle to furniture to anything that you can think of, on average, globally, from the point of manufacture to the point of actually consumption, where you take ownership of this product, the average increase in the price, as far as transportation costs are concerned, you double the price. It's 100%. So that the application of drones in terms of saving on transport costs is huge. And then a very interesting one, the number of firms in Europe that can utilize drones that because of their activities. 7.7 million firms, companies, that can actually utilize drones, of which a very small percentage at this stage is actually doing that. And that will obviously grow. And that second last point demonstrates the sunrise industry aspect of the drone industry, I believe. Estimated drone industry contribution to the US GDP until 2025 is about 82 billion. As far as the sectors are concerned, this 7.7 million firms in Europe, which sectors are they in? I don't think this will differ much from Europe to the US to South Africa. Construction, obviously, a huge impact. Architecture, engineering, land and pipeline transport, monitoring, real estate, advertising, agricultural, etc. And what I found interesting is that the security industry, which also includes the public sector, is actually a very small slice of the pie. But that's in terms of the number of firms. And I'm assuming that, for instance, national security, obviously, that will count as one firm in a country, whereas the private security industry in South Africa, there are literally thousands of firms. So that's skewed maybe a little bit. But just to give you an idea. As an intro to the results of the impact assessment, I collected the data from the survey amongst members of COASA, extrapolated that into total estimated turnover, determination of the average multiplier effects, that works through the input-output tables, that's national accounts data. It's not subjective, it's absolutely clinical data. Classification into direct, indirect, and induced impacts, etc. And then the calculation on output jobs and tax revenues. Comparing these results with SA, European Union, and South Africa, US GDP ratios, what I actually mean by that is when you do an impact assessment based on a survey which is not as large as you would like it to be, but still large enough that you can do the exercise, you need to have a cross-check. It's almost like accounting. You tel daarop en dan tel jy so op, né? Cross control, something like that. I started my career as an accountant, by the way, so I know all about this. I hope you won't do that against me. But I did see the light and moved into economics. So my cross-check was to look at the South African, EU, and SA-US GDP ratios and look at the size of their drone industry relative to their GDPs, and that worked out pretty well. What I found intriguing, just before I get to the most important slide in this deck, is the anticipated percentage increase in these key indicators in this industry: employment, the number of units, value of the equipment that you need, the turnover, and the value of the aircraft. Then it ranges from, I mean, at the bottom end, a double, more than 100%. This is incredible. I mean, if you were to look at the same type of growth areas in any other industry in this country, you won't remotely have these type of figures. This is based on the survey, by the way, and it doesn't differ much from last year. As a matter of fact, it is slightly lower. I had to change my scale a little bit. It is slightly lower on average than last year's. And now the meat of stuff, the meat of the exercise. Industry turnover, 3.4 billion rand. Closing in on 3.4 billion rand. Total contribution to total SA output as a result of the multiplier effects, more than 10 billion rand. That's a significant increase from last year. Broadening of the tax base, all of the main tax, major tax sources, the contribution, direct and indirect and induced, more than R1 billion each of them. Formal employment has also increased to more than 40,000 and informal employment 16,000. So the fact of the matter is that this is a meaningful industry. It's growing at a rapid rate of knots. And I would very much like to see what those figures are like next year. Just to give you an idea of how it all fits together, the total impact on the economy, you would be able to calculate by looking at the industry sales, that's the red one, plus the indirect output in other sectors, the direct output in other sectors, industry salaries and industry value added, and that adds up to the 10.7 billion. And then, of course, you have the income tax effect as well. So in any lobbying exercise, if this industry wants to lobby government for whatever, looking at regulations or the easing of regulations or the streamlining of the applications, whatever it may be, then I think it's pretty important to point out to them that you are making a meaningful contribution to this economy. And that if the regulations are too onerous, if they are not streamlined enough, then you are postponing economic activity. And that's your dilemma with regulations, is that you are postponing economic activity. If you need to get a license or some approval, environmental impact assessment before you can develop a property, for instance, just to use another industry as an example, and the people at the municipality that have to approve your building plans and all the other plans that you have, if they are forever, pushing obstacles in your way, and then when you finally get to the point where it looks good, then the person goes on leave for 3 weeks. And then he comes back, then he's on strike. Or then the bus driver's on strike and he can't get to work. I mean, this is really not good for an economy. Because you are postponing economic activity, and by definition that means you're going to have a lower growth rate than you would have had if it weren't for onerous regulations. And I'm convinced that Mr. Ramaphosa, within the next 2 years, will have a long, hard look at the regulatory environment in South Africa and ask himself and obviously the functionaries, the officials, to find out, is this really necessary? I'll give you one example. Mr. Gigaba's visa requirements. Who can remember that, 2014? I've got a slide on that a little bit later. Unfortunately, he's back at the helm there, but this time around, I think he knows that he's not going to be there for much longer. That's my personal opinion. By the way, I'm self-employed. So I have the luxury of being able to call a spade a spade. Just to give you an idea put some perspective on the size of this sector, of this industry. What I've done here is I've given you the total economic impact of the last last 6 Africa Aerospace and Defense exhibitions, one of the largest exhibitions of its kind in the Southern Hemisphere, which has a meaningful contribution to the economy, and that all of them are dwarfed by the size of this industry, which is really great stuff. And obviously you will participate probably in this year's. Am I right, Sean? There should be a huge presence at Waterkloof. September, we have the AID. 5-year GDP impact of the UA industry. This is now my cross-check. So what I've done is I've taken the impact assessment that I've got, and I've extrapolated that for 5 years at a 10% growth. That's the smallest one there. What it will be in 5 years from now. I've taken the relative figure for the US. That's the next one. Our industry going at 15%, then 20%, and then the SA EU GDP ratio. Funnily enough, in the European Union member countries, the drone industry relative to the size of the economy is actually larger than in the United States. And I think one of the reasons for that is that the US has an enormous oil industry and an enormous agricultural sector as well, which adds to their GDP. So it's more on the GDP side than in absolute terms. Okay, so I was hoping that would be pretty good news for you guys and girls. When I say guys, I actually mean nice people. Is that all right? It's not designed to be chauvinistic. It's been said that women that want to be equal to men have no ambition. I hope the men are not mad at me now. The macroeconomic advantages of the expansion of this industry. This is the type of stuff that I'm hoping and I'm convinced that whoever represents this industry in ending lobbying efforts with government will also point this out. You can look at that at your leisure. I will be providing Sean with an edited PDF version, especially of these slides. macroeconomic advantages of the expansion of this industry. This is really incredible stuff. I mean, if you look at this then, and you are a responsible member of the South African government, you will realize that we have to look after this industry because it can really assist us in becoming more competitive. There are 200 countries in the world that want to increase foreign direct investment inflows. We are not the only one. When Cyril Ramaphosa goes to London and he speaks to Theresa May and tells her, you must get some British companies to invest in South Africa, I can guarantee you that next week there will be people from Kenya, and then from Ghana, and then from Chile, and then from Vietnam, and they will also want the British firms to come in there. Everybody, it is an incredibly competitive environment. Just like golf, I suppose, or any other sport. I don't know too many pilot or airline jokes, but I know something. There's one nice little story about, which involves an instrument that you use in aeroplanes, obviously, and it's about this golfer that was complaining to his caddy. You know, as he was teeing off, he was telling his caddy, you know, stop looking at your watch all the time. You know, this is really putting me off. And the caddy looked around, he said, sir, this is not a watch, this is a compass. I hope you're not one of them. So suffice it to say that this industry is sizable, its scope is expanding, and it has an incredibly important role to play in the next decade in this economy of ours. Right. Moving on to the macroeconomy. Who of you is concerned about the land reform issue? By a show of hands. Who knows somebody that is? I mean, this is unbelievable. I'm assuming most of you watched the elective conference in December, the ANC elective conference. Am I correct? My experience was that it was like simultaneously watching a fairy tale and a horror movie. I think you know what I'm alluding to. So out comes Cyril Ramaphosa, and I'm running to my cabinet. I'm shouting at my wife, "Vanaand maak ek die Rubicon oop." Meerlust Rubicon, that is probably one of the finest wines that you can get, if you can still get it. Well, that vintage anyway. And the next minute, ice comes out of that. Oh, Vrede Dairy Farm, in any event. So, and he didn't win by a hell of a large majority. So he's got a tough task ahead. And it was a little bit of a pushback by the Zuma camp, obviously, that had something to do with this land expropriation issue. But since then, one interesting development is that at least 4 prominent ANC leaders have said publicly that they really question whether this was necessary to ask the Constitutional Review Committee in Parliament to look at this. By the way, this is not an instruction to change the Constitution. This is a request to the Constitutional Review Committee to find out whether it's a good idea or not. And they have to report back on 30 August and say whether they think it's a good idea. And that's only the first step. And they'll probably just postpone this until after the elections, because in the process, they are pinching Julius's potential votes. Interesting. His other source of votes, disgruntled students who never passed, but anyway, that's just... And now they're getting free education. So, you know, this is actually perhaps quite a smart move. But in any event, so that thing was thrown on the table, and at least 4 prominent leaders have since said that it's really not necessary to change the Constitution, because the minute you talk about changing the Constitution, this sounds like serious stuff, am I correct? I mean, it gives you an uncomfortable feeling. It will rattle foreign investors. It will rattle domestic investors. But if they just use the current Constitution, Section 25, which allows government to actually expropriate land, but with some compensation, if the public interest is compelling, and if the compensation is just and equitable. This is a totally different ballgame. This can happen anyway. And I like to believe that that's the route we'll follow in the future. But just to put your minds at ease, and I don't want to depress you, but we have to just realize that Mr. Ramaphosa and his new team, which he will be building in the next year or two, he cannot get rid of the Zupta clan overnight. And if there's anybody in this room that believes that there is not a split in the ANC, not officially, but de facto, split into 2 camps, then you are out of touch with the reality of this country's politics. And all you need to do is listen to Supra in Northwest to understand what I'm saying. There is a split in the ANC. But the good guys are winning, as far as I'm concerned. What did Mr. Ramaphosa inherit from his predecessor? A state of incompetence. I mean, how can you lose a state-owned enterprise, Petro SA? How can you lose 14.5 thousand million rand in 1 year? In 1 year. I mean, in a lifetime, maybe, if you're in aviation. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. I mean, this is unbelievable stuff. So the Auditor General goes in there and he gets asked, what went wrong there? He came back and he said, he cannot actually conduct a useful conversation with the executive leadership of that organization because they are too incompetent. They are too incompetent. It's not me, it's the Auditor General. The good news is that if you add those three together, Dudu Mayeni's contributions, he was always prepared to assist, 5.6 billion. Irregular municipal expenditure of 14.8 billion, all of that from at ANC municipalities. By the way, not one single municipality in the Northwest Province is functional. Not one. Thanks to Supra. That's the reason why he's going. Not because Mr. Ramaphosa doesn't like him. That's the reason why he's on his way out. Good riddance to bad rubbish, as far as I'm concerned. The good news is that if you add those three together, Petro SA and the ANC municipalities, you can build 650,000 RDP houses with that money. You can create 210,000 jobs. That's the way that we should go in South Africa. So there's some good news in this slide. And the other point I want to make is, do you really think, if you look at the way South African Parliament has operated in the last 2 years, there's been a decisive shift in their decision-making away from what is in the ANC's interests under Zuma and what is in South Africa's best interests. You follow my drift? And by the way, the ANC caucus in Parliament next year is going to look decidedly different. And I can guarantee you that that Parliament will act in South Africa's interests more and more as we move into the future. And they are not so stupid as to realize that we cannot replicate this in South Africa, what happened in Zimbabwe. Do we want a 95% unemployment rate? And spare a thought for the 4 million Zimbabweans in South Africa. I mean, they moved south. What is their next port of call? The South Pole. This is unbelievable. I can almost guarantee you that it will not happen. The land expropriation. And then what really irritates me about that decision at the elective conference is that it demonstrates a party under Zuma that had lost touch with what the voters, the people, the citizens of this country really want. Afrobarometer does a survey with European Union funds, thank you very much for that, in 36 African countries, amongst 50,000 respondents, including South Africa, and they asked them to rank the 3 problem areas that government needs to address. And these are the percentages cited in the top 3. They want jobs. They want decent clinics. They want good teachers that are not striking every day or harassing the kids. They want roads that you can actually travel on. Water, climate security must be addressed. Nowhere on this list is there a farm. And the South African Institute of Race Relations has done a similar survey, just more authoritative, more comprehensive, in South Africa. Guess what percentage of South Africans believe that land reform should be a priority of this government? Any suggestions? 1%. 1% of South Africa, I want to implore you to read that. It is good news. The South African Institute of Race Relations, Anthony Jeffrey's survey, is unbelievably good news. 80% of South Africans, this was gender, racial, income group, urban, rural mix representative, 80% believe that since 1994, race relations have either not gone down or improved. 80%. That's not the impression that was created through the Bell Pottinger exercise. Do you remember that one? For which they've apologized to this country and to the world. We don't need rifts between our cultural groups. I mean, we are diverse. We know we're diverse, am I right? By the way, I'm only 95% white and I can prove that. My forefathers was op en wakker. I'm just about finished with the land reform issue. there you have just a nutshell overview. 11 years ago, the ANC decided to look at Section 25. The funny thing is that because of the fact that 98% of all the legitimate land claims have already been settled, and 85% of those people took the money, right? Then they decide for the remaining issues, they look at Section 25. That was 11 years ago. Not one single test case. Why bring this onto the agenda right now? Why? To gain votes? People are not worried about that. They want jobs. That's what they want. They want houses. They want title deeds on the RDP houses. And access to a small mortgage loan, maybe 25% of the value of the property, with which you can buy a Jojo tank, start a little vegetable farm, build on a room for extra income to rent out. That's the kind of stuff that they want. But you can't discuss that with some of the people in the government because, I don't know, maybe they just don't understand economics. And an interesting point. Who of you saw Julius Malema and Floyd Shivambu's facial expressions on the day that this motion was passed in Parliament? Remember, it was an EFF motion. They should have been smiling, am I right? They should have been dancing. But you know what actually happened? They looked like somebody had stolen their breakfast. Or peed in their tea. But anyway, they were really disgruntled. Hulle het sulke dik bekke gehad. The gentleman from Belgium should understand that. A dik back. And the reason for that is that Mr. Ramaphosa was smart enough to introduce those caveats. The change must be sustainable, no harm whatsoever to the agriculture sector, no harm whatsoever to the economy. And the good news is that that is impossible. Because if you take a property that belongs to a private, individual, firm, pension fund, whoever owns it, private person or organization, then you will trigger the effects on this slide. And ultimately, you will have a lower GDP than you would have had, you would have lower tax revenues, and then this danger of junk status creeps in again. And I can guarantee you that our government doesn't want this. And what I can tell you is that I'm not going to let this, I'm going to try to do my bit to kill this stupid idea. And that's putting it mildly. And what I'm going to do with a team of Ilse Botha from UJ, she's our country's top econometrician. She was Ilse van Rensburg 25 years ago, my best student I ever had. But sy het reg getrou. She married the right guy, she's now Botha. And she didn't marry me, by the way. It's another Botha. And Keith Lockwood and Wandile Shishlobo. And what we want to do is we want to run this on the basis of starting out with an assumption of by how much will foreign direct investment and domestic capital formation decline if this starts happening. And we'll take a best case and a worst case scenario with very conservative assumptions, maybe 2.5% decline, and run that through an econometric model with which nobody will be able to find fault because it's national accounts input-output table data. Whether you're a capitalist or communist or something in between, you won't be able to find fault with the data. So we want to go to the Constitutional Review Committee and tell them, let's forget about the ideologies. Let's forget about the past and who stole land from who and did they actually steal it or whatever the case may be. Let's just look at what will happen if you do this. This is what will happen. And hopefully scare the living daylights out of them. So that's what I'm going to do. I just need some finance. Speak to Sean afterwards, please. He's got a hat here. But I have got one or two property developers that will be looking into this. It's not, it doesn't have to cost an arm and a leg, and we will do that with or without finance. This country's farmers are feeding the rest of this continent. This gap between Africa's GDP and Africa's agricultural value added, 90% of that gap is being filled by South African farmers who know how to farm. And if you look at the supply chain of agriculture, 2015, 84 billion total output, value added. Now you push it through retail, wholesale trade, finance, communication, all the sectors of the economy, it turns into 1.65 trillion rands worth of turnover. You cannot touch private property in this country without damaging the economy. So that caveat will kick in, whichever way you look at this. So as far as I'm concerned, it's stillborn. I hope I've put your minds at ease a little bit. Some other issues that Mr. Ramaphosa has to address is the fact that our debt-GDP ratio is increasing. the fact that our average ratio of foreign direct investment to GDP is pathetic compared to some of our peers. As a matter of fact, there it was just over 1%. In the last 3 years, on average, it dipped to below 1%, 0.7. This is Mr. Zuma's legacy. Well, one of the sad pieces of the sad legacy. Just to put that in perspective, Angola's is, in that period, 2015-17, was 14%. And I think we have better infrastructure and less landmines. You know the definition of a communist, don't you? I actually told this to Irvin Jim a couple of years ago at the E-News studios, and I asked him whether he knows the definition of a communist, and he didn't. I subsequently found out he doesn't know much about anything. But I told him anyway. A communist is somebody who's got nothing, but he wants to share it with you. GDP growth is not what we want it to be, but at least we bottomed out. And I predicted that bottoming out more or less at the same time that a couple of economists, they call themselves economists, one of them was one of my students, not a good student, were advising people to sell everything, including their cars, and take the money offshore when the rand was 16. Not a very good idea, am I right? I mean, by the way, how will you get to work then? It's not really a lousy idea. And I predicted the bottoming out of our GDP growth trend accurately. I don't always get it right, but when I do, I tell people. We had this magnificent property price surge to Africa. A lot of the people in this room will know exactly what I'm talking about. Some of us bought second and third properties to rent out. And then the recession kicked in, and then the Reserve Bank raised interest rates, and then growth went into downward mode, GDP growth, and since then nothing much has happened. But I can almost guarantee you, if you analyze the property market the way I've done, we had 7 golden years, ending roughly 28, 29, and then when it kicked off again, after the recession, we've had 7 lean years. The next 7 golden years have just begun. I can almost guarantee you that. You can also see it in the flattening out of the real value of mortgage loans, which has been in consistent decline since the recession. Inter alia thanks to the Reserve Bank, but that will probably start going up again. The number of applications for mortgage loans at the banks in South Africa, the first quarter of this year, has started to increase at a nice rate. And then, now that the Guptas are not here, my public enemy number one is, in fact, the Reserve Bank. And more specifically, the Monetary Policy Committee. Because when my colleague at Gibbs, Jill Marcus, when she was governing the Reserve Bank, she was smart enough to realize that a central bank should strike a balance between combating inflation and preserving growth. Can I sell that to you? I mean, you can't combat inflation and risk a recession, am I correct? So you need to strike a balance. And she was smart enough to realize a 3% real prime rate, so that's the prime rate minus inflation rate. That should be okay. And there was not one economist in this country that differed from her. And then she retired. And then for some reason, the new kids on the block. And by the way, most of the MPC appointments in the last couple of years were political appointments. I would expect a Monetary Policy Committee member of the most influential economy on this continent to at least have a master's degree in economics, preferably a PhD, and at least 15 years experience with economic policy making. And preferably, possibly teaching and some extensive writing and research experience. That is unfortunately not the case. Now, our real prime rate is more than double what it was in Jill Marcus's term. And I'm fighting them tooth and nail. I'm on the verge of being proclaimed persona non grata. But I send these slides to them. Okay, now quantifying the Ramaphosa effect. We're moving into good news territory now, by the way. The rand is more than 30% stronger today than it was on 21 January 2016. And I know that's bad news for many of you. But it's very good news. Well, it's good news. It's good news if you're importing, all right. It's bad news if you're exporting. Am I correct? Exporters don't like a strong rand. They never liked a strong rand. It was until recently. It was 40% stronger. That was a world record. And certainly this has got a lot to do with our new president. If you want to look into the future, I'm convinced that I want to preempt a question. As a matter of fact, Sean, what is the currency likely to do? It is marginally overvalued. the South African rand today is marginally overvalued compared to its long-term real average rate. That's against a basket of our currencies of our 15 major trading partners, and obviously the US, the UK, the Eurozone, China and Japan, they account for probably about 85% of that. If you look at what's happening in our economy, growth is starting to improve. You have capital formation taking place, so imports are increasing. Exports are not doing too badly, but our trade surplus is shrinking. So the fundamentals, and we're attracting, you can, in my next slide, I'll show you, I just want to jump to that one. If your long-term bond yield does this, it means that the value of your bonds is increasing. So people are investing in our economy. It tells me that basically, if you look at the fundamentals, the trade balance and the financial account balance, the rand's next movement should be towards 13. So the recent uptick to 12.50 was as a result of a strong dollar and these fundamentals. It's clawed its way back a little bit because there's still this honeymoon era around Ramaphosa, but don't be surprised if the rand later this year starts moving back to 12.50, 12.60, 12.70. That would be a natural phenomenon because it is marginally overvalued. I hope that's useful information. Second Ramaphosa effect is the fact that our bond yield came down by 100 basis points. This is magnificent stuff. If a ratings agency wants to downgrade a country's bonds, it must do so when the yield is increasing, because that means that the value of the bond is declining. There's that inverse relationship. So it would have been crazy for Moody's to downgrade us. And in a survey amongst, I don't know how many, about 35 economists by Fin Media, a week before the Moody's decision, I was absolutely astounded that 20% of these economists were predicting that we would be downgraded to junk status. I can guarantee you they were not students of mine. It's just a stupid thought. What Moody's did in November when S&P jumped the gun, Moody's said, whoa, we must just wait a little bit because there are two events that are going to take place in South Africa in the short term that will have a huge impact on what the currency and the value of the bond and the bond yield is going to do. And those two events were the elective conference, where Ramaphosa was elected, and the first budget following that event in February. And on the back of those two events, Moody's not only retained our investment grade status, they actually improved our outlook from negative to stable. So that's an effective upgrading. Brilliant stuff. That's really good for our economy. It's good for confidence. Speaking of confidence, the Stellenbosch Bureau for Economic Research Confidence Index amongst consumers has hit an all-time record high. What is an all-time record high? 35 plus 18, 50, 53 years. Since its inception. It has never gone to the level where it is right now. Consumer confidence in this economy is at an all-time record high. That is really good news. And you can also see that in the retail sales. I don't want to give Mr. Ramaphosa all the credit. We have to take some ourselves, am I right? Who of you bought a drone between October and December? I know some of you bought some beer. And Clippies. He reigned in Eskom's profligacy. He did that even before he became president. And with a bit of luck, they'll be on a more sustainable path. And he canned the nuclear power deal project, which was an unbelievably stupid idea from the beginning. Just a quick one on trends in household financial resilience. What frustrates me in my profession is that when you have a 21-year-old journalist writing a story in economics without actually having passed Economics 1. And then they get data from the National Credit Regulator, which says that 10,000 people have filed for, what do they call it? This, when you go to the credit regulator, when they have to help you to budget, to spend your money more wisely. What do they call that? Debt relief, debt counseling, and so on. And then this journalist writes a story as if, and the idea is created that we are all bankrupt, or very close to that. So let's look at what it's really like. Well, our real salaries are increasing in the public and the private sectors. So that's not so bad. And employment creation, we created in the last quarter more than 200,000 jobs in this economy. 200,000 jobs. You can clearly see the upward trend. It's not enough. I know we've got an unemployment problem, but we're moving in the right direction. And this is still in the aftermath of the worst economic period in our history. The worst decade. Ratio of household disposable income to household debt is increasing. This is also good news. If you look at the reciprocal of that, our household debt disposable income ratio is now just above 70%. This means that if you take all your income, salary, wages, bonus, rent, interest, dividends, bribes, empties, zakgeld, gambling proceeds, everything, and you put it into your debt. In South Africa, it takes you 9 months, you've got zero debt left. What do you think that figure is in Australia, that percentage? Who wants to take a guess? That would have been a good call. It's 200%, 2 years. Takes the average Australian household 2 years. Serves them right for ball tampering. The point I want to make is that our ratio is way too low. The Australian economy is a model economy. If you apply a filter of 5 million minimum population size in your per capita GDP calculation, Australia is the richest country in the world. It's also overregulated and terribly boring, but the fact of the matter is that the Reserve Bank should ease the pressure on consumers. It should lower the cost of capital, bring down the rates. They're taking a decision next week. Next week, yes, 24th, I believe. If I were to become governor of the Reserve Bank tomorrow, I would lower the interest rate by 2.3 percentage points. And in the old days, I had a good chance, actually, to become governor, I mean. But anyway, why do I say that? Inflation has dropped in the last 15 months by 280 basis points. That's 2.8 percentage points. They've given us twice 25 bips. So deduct 50 basis points from that. They owe us 230 basis points. I'm serious. And I'm going to keep on pointing that out to them. This is exceptionally good news, especially for your industry, because durable consumption expenditure is increasing. It turned around an 8-quarter negative trend. And that is really very good news. Buying a drone will fit obviously snugly into durable consumption. Depending on if it's a second-hand one, maybe it will go into semi-durables. The biggest, obviously, item in our economy, most economies, is non-durables, which is essentially food and clothes, including this shirt of mine. It's a Woolies polycotton. It has enough cotton to feel vaguely comfortable and enough polyester to last for 6 years. I am an economist. You know the definition of an economist? It's somebody that will marry Charlize Theron for her money. Which is not a bad idea, depending on the mood she's in. Household disposable income. This is a shortcut. You want to find out, if you want to look at one indicator that gives you a sense of what's happening in an economy, go to household disposable income. This is more than 50% of our GDP. We're talking here of a figure of almost 2.8 trillion rand. And it took us 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 quarters to get back to our previous all-time record high in real terms, inflation adjusted. We've beaten that now. And I don't think this baby is going to go down again. Not in the next 7 years. Junk state is averted. I'm just about finished. And other good news. The impression that was created that whites are becoming richer and blacks are becoming poorer is such a lot of nonsense that it defies comprehension. Between 2005 and 2015, this is the total increase in average household income for population groups in South Africa. The red line is the CPI. So anything above that is a real increase. So that turns that little myth around, shatters that. In 2015, the number of black households in this country that are in the 650,000 rand per annum category expenditure and income, which is more or less the same because our marginal propensity to save is 0. So that's an easy one to calculate. Overtook whites for the first time, and that gap will just grow exponentially. It's a demographic imperative. It's as easy as that. And this is good news because it means, and if you look at the data, the household surveys, every single year since 1994, every year since 1994, the racial income inequality gap has been closing every single year. And I'm not saying that we should just leave it now. Yes, there's a hell of a lot of work to be done out there with regard to poverty combating, etc. But if you give somebody a job, you take his income from 0 to whatever he's going to earn. That is quite a nice percentage increase if you understand the maths. That's the best way, and Cyril Ramaphosa has said this, the best way to combat poverty in this country is to create jobs. That's the one where you can annihilate poverty if you create enough jobs. And we'll slowly but surely, I think, move on that road. Our debt GDP ratio is still low by international standards. Greece is in the room next door. We are one of only 2 emerging markets in the world that can afford to pay such a large slice of our total tax revenues out to grants. 17 million grant recipients, that's a boon to this country's ability to provide a social security welfare net to 17 million people. That is very good news. We are still the most competitive economy on the continent. Mauritius is more competitive, but they're not actually on the continent. Our balance of payments is stable. These are the 10 largest economies in the world ranked by their 2017 growth estimates. And as you can see, the countries that we trade with, the big guns out there, they are all doing pretty well. That's good news for us. And one of my favorite slides, you can see the GIGABA effect here in 2014 and 2015 with those unbelievably stupid regulations. I mean, at the time, I just thought to myself, how is this possible? That we have the most porous boundaries in the world. If you come in from Mozambique without a cent in your pocket, and you can get past the lions and the elephants and the rhinos, you're welcome. Well, there's not much they can do about it. But if you come in from Europe with a couple of €1,000 in your pocket with an aeroplane, well, then we may want to make it really difficult for you. It was such a crazy idea. Fortunately, Derek Hanekom, who's back at tourism now, is back in the cabinet. Derek Hanekom in 2014, towards the end of 2014, finally convinced him to marginally relax those regulations. And look what happened in 2016 as a direct result. I can give this slide a subtitle, The Power of Deregulation. And last year, we hit an all-time record high. This is incredibly good news, and I don't have to tell you that within this broad tourism industry, there are a hell of a lot of drone applications in future, directly and indirectly, especially indirectly. My final slide. The stuff we're exporting after a 7-year decline in prices, when I didn't get my Kumba dividend for 2 years in a row, and that's supposed to be my pension. That share price went from 650 Rand a share to 30 Rand. I had to prolong my career, which is one of the reasons why I'm here. But now we're getting dividends again, handsome dividends as a matter of fact, and this is unbelievably good news, not only for South Africa, but for this whole continent. Because South Africa is still a huge commodity exporter. We've had political change in Zimbabwe. Mr. Mnangagwa is slowly but surely undoing the damage of nationalization in that country. Mr. Dos Santos is no longer there. The new president of Angola was in his office 6 weeks when he fired Isabel Dos Santos, the richest woman in Africa, one of the richest in the world. I tried to date her once, but she never answered my emails. Sy's nogal sag wie oog, maar in elk geval. And he got rid of Dos Santos' son as well, who embezzled that $5 billion, which is lying in a bank in Mauritius. They are in discussions with agricultural organizations in South Africa to resuscitate the agricultural sector. I'm actually involved in that process of providing them with a holistic agricultural development plan. In Luanda, your average food item costs 3 times what it costs in Joburg. That is unbelievable if you look at that country's agricultural potential. So there are things happening here. We've had profound political change in this country, and I am certainly looking forward to the next 7 years at least. Thank you.